In this video, we're going to cover how to take in the waist of a jean. Here on the table, we've got a beautiful orange denim that we've already marked in the fitting. We're going to start by cutting off the tags like usual. And we're going to take a look at the center back seam. This is one of my favorite ways to take in a pant with all of this top stitching. So it might be a casual pant or khaki or jeans. We're going to start by removing the top stitching from the belt loop and the back seam. That way we'll be able to take in through the waist and the seat to make the pant overall smaller. Let's get started. We're going to take our seam ripper and we're going to very carefully begin to rip off the belt loop. This is the most time-consuming part of the procedure, carefully taking out the top stitching. Don't be alarmed when you start to see the undyed portion. Belt loops are often put on before the garment has been dyed, so we just have to make sure that we recover that later. Then we're going to do the same on the top. Be careful to watch your fingers as you are pushing the seam ripper through. Take your time. We don't want to cut holes in the garment, and we also don't want to harm ourselves. Almost there. Okay, we've removed the belt loop completely, and we're going to set that aside. Next, we're going to go to the inside. I like to pin back these flaps so that they stay out of my way. This is the front of the jean. Okay, now we've got a good view of the inside and back. Because we're taking the garment in through the back, we often have to remove this label. If the client wants the label put back on, we are happy to replace it, but it's not critical to put that back. And now we're going to set that aside as well. And now we are ready to open that waist seam. So we're going to remove just enough stitching here so that we can open this waist seam and cut a new seam in to make it smaller. And we can do that just by releasing these stitches, either on the right side of the garment or very carefully cutting the individual stitches in between the two layers of the waistband. We want to do that nice and slow so that we don't tear the fabric. Perfect, and as you can see, that's coming apart. Let's pull those little threads out as we move to keep everything clean and keep them from getting stuck. See how we're just cutting those individual stitches? Great, perfect. And we'll do the same for the bottom of the waistband as well. So we'll reach our hand in there, pull those extra threads off, and gently slide the seam ripper in so that we can cut a few. We always want to be pulling the garment. There it goes. Sometimes we get lucky and that seam will pull off, and then we just need to release the thread from the other side. Okay, let's see if we've given ourselves enough room. Cut off that extra thread so it's not in the way. And now we've got the center back seam and the two parts of the waistband, inside and outside, all separated from each other. That's perfect. Let's lay the pant back down. And now we're going to draw ourselves a little line right in the center. Let's flip to the outside of the garment and look at where we marked it. These are the markings from the fitting. Let's measure and see how much we need to take the garment in. Again, markings aren't exact in fittings because the person is wearing the garment. So if it's a little more on one side and a little less on the other, let's balance it out and make it totally symmetric. So from mark to mark, it is 1.5 inches. So we are going to measure 3/4 of an inch on one side of our seam and 3/4 of an inch on the other. making a total of, we'll move our slider to keep us on track, 1.5 inches. Perfect. Now we are going to cut the waistband. So now we're ready to cut the waistband. We're going to cut in this seam so that we can make this smaller, but we can't leave this extra on the inside. If we just pinched it and sewed it, we would have all of this extra bunched up on the inside. It's not going to lay flat enough and it's not going to be comfortable. So we have to cut it. But keep in mind, this is a very important cut. It needs to be straight and it needs to be right in the center because we can't go back. So carefully mark this cut and let's get our good thick scissors out to cut this thick fabric and cut right along our line. Then we'll do the same on the outside. We still have our marks here from our fitting, but we're going to draw a center line in directly on top of where we just cut and do the same. Perfect. Now we're ready. Next, we're going to pin these sides back so that we have better access to our center back seam. We're just getting them out of the way. This is the last bit of tricky seam ripping that we have to do before we can really get sewing. These stitches are usually pretty heavy. We'll have to go one at a time. We won't be able to cut both seams at a time, but we're just going to cut them exactly the same like we did on the waistband. Carefully moving down the line. And we're going to cut to about halfway down the pocket. If the garment doesn't have pockets, we're going to go about 6 inches down. We'll make a mark there to give us an indicator. And we're going to cut both of these seams all the way down to there. We'll mark the 6 inches on the outside as well. Perfect. And now we're just cutting those seams. We're going to move the garment so that the seam ripper is cutting away from us. And just cutting 2 or 3 seams at a time. Because again, we don't want the seam ripper to slide and cut a hole in the fabric. That will be very hard to cover. Okay, we've finished seam ripping the 2 lines of top stitching that hold the center back seam together. So this is the front and this is the inside of the back of the garment, as you can see. Now, we're going to take that center back seam in first before we move up to the waist. So we're going to move our seam allowance out. This is a flat felled seam, so it's been turned under and sewn in a certain way that the denim factory produces jeans. We're going to fix it a little bit differently. We're going to take our seam allowances and match them up together. Now remember, we're taking the garment in 1.5 inches at the waist. We're going to start by matching that on the seat, but then we're going to merge back in as this seam goes over the backside. So we can see from our stitching, we can even set it back in place if we need to. We can see that we need to come 1 inch, 3/4 of an inch on one side, just like we did on the waist, and 3/4 of an inch on the other side, which when it's sitting flat together is again 1.5 inches. Perfect. Now we're going to unfold that and match up those seam allowance edges together. We've got a chalk mark on that side and our chalk mark on that side, so we're just going to pin straight through. Great, perfect. Now we're going to sit this out and take a look at how this edge needs to merge back into that seam to look natural. We want to keep the line straight if we can, but it's got to curve a little bit. If we get to this point and we see, oh, I think we need to take this seam down a little bit more, we can cut a little bit more into that top stitching to give us that flexibility. The most important thing is to make sure that this seam isn't super sharp. It needs to be gradual to look natural. So we'll undo a little bit more of that top stitching to get that where it needs to be. Good, I like that. And as we mark, you can see now that we've reached where the original stitching holes were. It's very hard to see, but look for those original stitching holes and we can see. So see how we've got that nice, slightly curved, new chalked seam that brings us back in line with the stitching that's already there. And we're just gonna pin right along that line. Now, as we get closer into the seat, make sure that you leave the seam allowances that are folded together still folded together as it gets closer to matching up with that original seam. That'll be a little bit of tricky sewing to get that perfectly lined up, but we can do it. There we go. Okay, now that is ready to be sewn and serged. After we sew and serge this section, then we'll be ready to finish up the waistband. So we're looking at our center back seam that we just pinned, and we're over here with the serger. We've got our matching thread. Because this is going to be a visible seam, we want to get as close to a matching thread color as we can, so we're threaded up in orange. Now, when we come back to do the waist with the straight stitch machine, we're going to put a nice secure straight stitch in there. But for now, we just want to clean up this edge and take care of this frayed threads. So we're just going to run the edge through. We're not going to cut off a bunch, just run the edge to get that cleaned up. We're going to start at the bottom, lifting the presser foot and placing the seam allowance underneath. This gives us more control inside the garment and allows us to just run off the end when we get to the end. Okay, now we want to make sure that none of our pins holding our chalk in place, our chalked line in place, go under the presser foot. So if we're afraid that that might happen in this closer area of the seam, we want to remove those. Again, no pins can go under the presser foot because they risk hitting the knife. All right. We've got everything set, let's go. We're just barely trimming the edge off, just enough to catch these frays. When we get to the bottom, we're just gonna run straight off. Unlike a straight stitch machine, sergers chain the thread off the end of a seam. Beautiful. And when we've left ourselves a little tail, we're just going to clip at the garment and clip off the tail from the beginning. Now that we've serged our raw edge, we're here at the straight stitch machine to finish up our sewing. We're going to close up the back center seam. And this is a little bit tricky because, as you can see, we're working with a flat felled seam that still has the top stitching underneath. We're only altering up to this point. So we want to make sure that the seam we put in now matches up perfectly there. Let's look inside. We're going to carefully move this fabric apart and feel where the fabric is flat enough that we can start our sewing without pinching any fabric inside. That looks good to me. We'll take a look after we sew it. It takes a little trial and error. So let's put this under the machine and pull our pin out and flatten both of our sides. Okay. Give it a few back stitches, and now we're just following our chalk line that we made before. There we go. All the way up. And back stitch at the top. All right, let's see how we did. Okay, we have a little bit of a pucker here. So we're gonna go back and try one more time on this side. We're just gonna release a couple of the stitches here until we see that flatten back out. Beautiful. Now we'll secure from the inside, and then we'll finish adjusting this to make it totally flat once we go back to our top stitching. So we're back inside where our stitch began, just to backstitch in that area because this is a high stress area. It's going to see a lot of movement from the wearer. So let's give that perfect, just a little more security. Now, we're going to push this seam over to one side and just give it a little finger press and pin through the serging to hold it in place. Because now we're ready to go back out to the outside and put that top stitching back in. So let's lie these flat, take a look at our overall placement, and make sure that the seam is equidistant from the pockets and coming straight down the center, and it is. That looks beautiful. We're going to start with our first line of stitching as close as we can to that new seam. So we're going to take that first line of stitching barely 1/8 of an inch from our new seam. So let's line it up. Give it a few back stitches. Good. And as we sew, we're feeling underneath the garment to make sure the front and the pockets are all out of the way and that our seam allowance stays smooth and pressed down where it's been pinned. Good. We can feel through the fabric that this is a single layer. We're also pulling gently to make sure that our stitching goes straight through without any bulging on the side of the seam. I'm sewing close enough to the seam that I can see the edge of the seam lined up with the opening in the presser foot. Again, keeping a little tension on either side. Great. And then I'm feeling underneath here, pulling the rest of the jean away to make sure that nothing is getting caught underneath. And I'm actually going to pull this pin out. There we go. So that I can really make that nice and smooth as we line it up with our previous stitching. Almost there, pulling tight, and give good back stitch there. Beautiful. Beautiful. All right, let's put in the second line. Same distance as our original stitching away from the first line. We're finally ready to put back the waistband. So let's release these pins and start with the internal waistband. We're going to match up where we cut. And if you recall, we took 3/4 of an inch from either side of the center back. That's a total of 1.5 inches. We're going to do the same here. Now keep in mind, because we cut this and it wasn't a seam before, we don't have any seam allowance to account for when we're measuring. We're just going straight from the cut and measuring 3/4 of an inch, right where my blue ruler is. And we're going to put a little pin in there. And we're going to make sure that we fold out the seam allowances. We want this seam to be nice and smooth all the way through, and then we'll fold them back in when we're ready to top stitch. Let's measure once more to make sure. Yes, perfect. As you can see, I marked that 3/4 of an inch in with my blue water-soluble marker, just so that I could take that pin out and get a good clean start. Now, I'm holding underneath, pushing the seam allowance out, and as always, smoothing both layers to make sure that I don't have any pinches or puckers. Get a good back stitch in there to secure that, and then we're going straight to the other side. And another good back stitch. Beautiful. Let's see where we're at. Now we're looking at the inside of the garment. So we're matching up this seam with our new seam. And that looks great. We're also making sure that we took the same amount from the waistband as we did from the pant, so that when we reattach them in a moment, they will line up perfectly. That's great. All right, put a pin in it, and let's move to the outside waistband and do the same thing. All right, we're in the home stretch. Now, we are going to pin all of the layers of the pant and both waistbands back together. We'll find our bottom waistband and fold that up underneath. Same with the top. Now we're spreading our seam allowance and opening that nice and wide so that it's as flat as it can be. With a bulky fabric like this, it's really important that we get that seam allowance as flat as we can. Great. Then I like to just pin it down together, matching up those seams. Beautiful. Pins might fight you a little on that. Same with the bottom. The bottom is a little bit trickier as we'll be sliding that pant inside. So we're taking the outside and folding the seam allowance down with the seam allowance spread. We are matching it up so that the seam of our waistband is directly on top in the middle of our double stitching. And then flipping to the inside to do the same. Checking that it's open. And beautiful, perfect. Hold it in place on that side, and then check the other side. Great. Now, we're going to sew this top stitch from the outside. So let's move our pins before we get sewing so that we don't forget they're there. We'll do them one at a time, starting with the top. We'll begin our stitching right where our top stitching ended, and do a good back stitch on top of that stitching to make sure it's secure. And then the most important thing we want to line up are those two center back seams in the waistband that we created. And now we're just stitching through all layers and the folded down seam allowance all at once in one clean stitch. We are barely a 1/16 of an inch away from that edge, just like the original stitching. So go slow and take your time. We want this to look clean and beautiful. This is one of the most visible parts of this alteration. Beautiful. Same with the bottom. Let's remove the pin, but hold everything secure as we slide it under the machine and pick up our stitching right where it stopped. Now we're going through quite a few layers here, so it's okay if it runs a little slow. Just take it easy and make sure we're hitting everything in place. If there are any puckers, just stretch the fabric and smooth it out. There we go. Beautiful. Almost there. And stitching directly over top of the stitching there. Back stitch. Let's take a look. Perfect. We also want to look underneath and make sure that we caught that bottom edge, and we did. We'll clip a little threads, and now the final step, to throw our belt loop right back on over top of our new seam. All right, we've got our belt loop, and now all we need to do is pop that little guy right back on. Now, this many layers of fabric, no pin is going to go through, so we are just going to hold it in place directly over top of that seam. Starting at the top, we're centering our belt loop directly over top of our seam, and then carefully, very carefully, holding it in place and stitching back and forth, I would say a good 4 times, and cut. Now smooth the belt loop down, making sure we have nothing caught underneath while we're sewing. Smooth the belt loop down, and the same thing on the bottom. Center directly over top of our center back seam. And that is it. So as you can see on the inside of the garment, it looks like it's been altered, but more importantly, we kept it clean, we kept it strong, and we kept it looking beautiful. And from the outside, even better. Almost impossible to detect, but will make all the difference in the world to our client.